Okay, so thank you for all of you guys who are doing the course evaluations. Again, that closes on the last day of class. Let me just make sure my mics and stuff are on. Okay, so we've got quite a few people that are missing class today, so I want to make sure that they get all this information. Okay, so the stuff that we're going to do today, we're, do this evaluation. If you don't have time to do it now, we'll do it later. We'll talk about that assigned paper that you guys had. We'll finish up our ecological restoration that we didn't get through on Tuesday. And then depending on how much time we have, we'll talk about some invasive fungi that are particularly problematic. Okay, so what did you guys think of this paper that I had you read this last couple of days? Yeah. Yeah, it was short. And so there wasn't a lot of time for extra stuff. Easier to read, easier to understand than the last one. Hopefully. All right. So what did this Norton guy say some of the problems with, or like the long-term implications of losing biodiversity? And I will just set the stage. Remember that this is, he's talking about things that are happening in New Zealand. And just for the historical context, New Zealand doesn't have native mammals. Like all the things that we think of, like when we think of deer, grazers and predators and all that, those ecological niches that mammals fill here, birds filled in New Zealand historically. And then it was when white people came along and started bringing mammals to sheep to graze and whatnot. We actually saw a huge amount of loss of those bird species, that biodiversity. Anyway, so what does he say? Like, what's the problem with that? In the long term. Okay, I'll just tell you. So he's talked a lot about how it disconnects mutualists, right? So the example that he gave, this is just a snip of the figure that was in the paper. He talked about how there's all these tree species that have to have their seeds go through the gut of a bird. And there used to be a lot of different species of birds that could do this, that could break down that seed coat. And when the birds poop it out, then that seed's ready to germinate. And without that processing through the bird's gut, those seeds don't ever germinate. So there used to be lots of birds that did this. And now there's one species left in some parts of New Zealand. And so if this New Zealand pigeon goes extinct, then there's nothing left to disperse those seeds and to allow for that seed germination. So this disconnect of mutualists is particularly problematic in New Zealand and in other places too, where we see lots of biodiversity loss. All right. So, one of the things with invasive species management is like, well, we can't get rid of them, right? So these invasive species, they're just here. But if we can reduce their populations to a low enough level, then that should be fine, right? What does Norton think about that? Is that going to work according to him? Is that going to change the ecological damage that is done by some of these animal pests, as he called them? Right. Yeah. So he's like, nope, it's not going to really matter because you know, he used this example of these Scottish deer that just plow through everything. And there's these little tiny native trees that are heavily browsed, and these deer browse, they eat everything, right? They're teenage boys, they just eat everything. And so even a few deer can really have some serious negative impacts on the population of trees, because they just eat everything. And then with this idea of losing those seed dispersals, birds, there's not going to be any seedlings left for those deer to eat, you know? So it's confounding factors, or like these confounding effects. All right, so, you know, he makes this argument that we're going to always have to have human intervention to deal with these invasive plants. And why does he say that? What's his argument? What example did he use? Okay. So he talked a lot about, you know, we have all these, there's all these invasive grasses and forbs in New Zealand that are competing for habitat and other resources with the native plants. And at least in New Zealand, you know, there's lots of plants that need very specific biotic and abiotic conditions to grow. And they can only grow, they have a very narrow niche envelope, right? They have to, like, there's this much that they can do. They have to have these certain things, but these native or these invasive plants, you know, their envelopes are much bigger and broader. And so they can live where these plants can and cannot live. And so they're able to outcompete them. And so he's worried about having loss of these native plants without human intervention to keep these other guys that are better competitors under control. Okay. All right, so he used a couple examples to talk about some unintentional effects of restoration. Can you guys think of any of those? Remember any of the things that he talked about? Yeah.
At the end of the paper, it said that removing livestock from grazing fields stops.
Yeah, so right, so that was kind of his big argument with this unintended consequences thing, is like, let's just, if we take the grazers out, there's going to be some unintentional consequences. And the first thing he talked about was this this invasive plant is able to outcompete the invasive grasses in these abandoned agricultural fields, which actually in turn allows the native trees to come back, right? So the native plants are kind of using this invasive shrub as a nurse plant. And so it's actually kind of beneficial to have this native shrub around. But, you know, he does make the point that the community of native trees, the species composition is going to be different in like a pure stand that was never invaded, or in an area that had been invaded. So, but at least we'll have some of these native trees. You know, but there's always a but, right? It's always a but. So that was a positive unintended consequence, but he talked about how, you know, grazing was removed in order to try to increase the numbers of this cute little skink thing. But what happened when they took the grazers away? Sorry, say it again.
The rodents there?
The rodents came, yeah, and so their numbers of the skink that they were trying to save went way, way down because the rodents population went up because there was more seeds of these invasive grass species for the rodents to eat. So it's kind of like, you know, it's hard. It's like the point of this is that restoring is hard because there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily fully understand and understand the cascading effects of something. Okay, is there any more comments anybody wants to make about this before we move on? All right. So he says that reversing biotic thresholds that have been crossed because of invasive species, like that's going to be really hard to come back from, like maybe impossible. You know, he talked about how abiotic things are okay. Like we can restore hydraulic regimes. We just knock down the dams and stop groundwater pumping. We can do that. Just whether we will, whether people will agree to it, you know, that's a different story. But recovering from those biotic things, that's going to be really hard. And why is it so hard? Why is it harder to recover from the biotic effects? So I'll tell you. So we've been talking about the legacy effects that tamarisk has on soil. So tamarisk increases the salinity and the nitrogen levels in the soil. It decreases the amount of mycorrhizal fungi. You take tamarisk away and those things are still happening. That's a legacy effect. You remove it, but the effects of that invasive species are still present. And so even if we have the technology and the resources to eliminate it, we still have some of these lingering effects, you know, and again, especially in New Zealand, where you have extinctions, you can't bring that species back. It's gone. You can't reverse that. Although people are trying to bring it back, woolly mammoths, which makes you wonder, okay, you can, but should you? All right. Oh, and then here's the last thing that I didn't make 2 slides out of. So I kind of wanted you guys to pull out of this paper is that we're always going to have a mix of natives and non-natives. Like, you know, probably, especially in the Southwest, that's how we manage riparian systems, is that we've got native cottonwoods and willows and we've got tamarisk. We're not going to be able to get rid of it. It's just here. And then the thing that you do to get rid of one invasive species isn't necessarily going to get rid of a different invasive species. We talked about how we chainsawed down that tamarisk and the Russian thistle came in, you know? So, and in order to deal with this, we're going to have to just have some ongoing management. It's just going to cost money and it's going to be hard. And that's just the reality of that we live in now. So that's super great and pessimistic. Okay, so, but I wanted you guys to have this context of succession. So I think a lot of you guys have probably heard about this before. This is, you know, every basic ecology, biology textbook probably has something like this. That, you know, succession is basically when there's a new habitat that comes available, there's a predictable cycling of life, right? So if there's a volcano, we expect that the first thing that's going to colonize that new island is going to be, you know, grasses or whatever. And then we'll start to see the shrubs and the trees come in. And then those trees will be replaced with other trees. And we kind of have this, so that's primary succession, like when there's a brand new habitat, a glacier retreating, or, you know, just think about any kind of natural process where there would be new land exposed. But in this case is secondary succession. So we had an ecosystem, right? And then there was this big catastrophic fire that came in and killed everything, leaving a blank slate. What do we know? What did we learn about in this class about an ecosystem that looks like that? Yeah, Tyler. Yeah, that looks like a really great place for an invasive species to come in, particularly if you make a lot of babies. Or like if this soil is completely sterilized, if you are dependent on mutualists, symbiotic fungi, you're not going to be able to establish in that, right? But somebody that doesn't depend on mutualists is going to be like, yes, this is just for me. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's no guarantee that following some kind of huge natural disaster that we're going to end up with the same thing that we started with, right? Because now we have things like invasive species that are going to come in and change. So, you know, here's the successional trajectory. Well, an invasive species might alter that. And now we're going to go and end up at some other ecosystem type. So, and you know, and maybe that's fine, right? As long as those components of ecological function are still there. We still have nutrient cycling. We still have enough primary productivity to support predators and stuff. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about before I got too lost in the weeds, was this idea of passengers and drivers of ecological change. So, you know, we talked about how that change in successional trajectory due to that fire, like, where does the invasive species come in? Does it cause that change in trajectory of the succession? Or is it the driver? Or is it the passenger? Does it, because there was some kind of ecological change, some kind of disturbance, what have you, then they came in and took advantage of that. And so there's competing hypotheses. And anytime there's like an either or, a nature versus nurture, a plant stress versus plant vigor hypothesis, a driver of ecological change or a passenger of ecological change, usually it's a mix of both. So lots of invasive species are both the cause of ecological change and also the result of ecological change, so both passengers and drivers. And there's a little paper that explains that if you want to read that. But when you throw in more passengers, it complicates the situation a little bit more, right? So this driver might get a little bit stressed out and make a wrong turn or what have you, you know, for the analogy. Okay, so keeping that in mind, let's go back to this concept that we were talking about when we ended last time on Tuesday. So remember, we were talking about agricultural fields that are abandoned, and then how to restore that to a native ecosystem. And so I was telling you about the study that took some of these fields in the UK, and they spread some dirt that they got in a grassland across this field, or they spread some dirt from a heathland across the agricultural field. And I showed you these graphs that are like, what is this? Remember, these graphs are looking at species community, like composition. So we're looking at what species are present and how many of each of those species are present. And in order to show that kind of complex, multi-dimensional thing, we smash it down, we rub math on it, and we smash it down into a graph that looks like this. It's basically the closer the two dots are together, the more similar the community looks. And if the dots are far apart, then they're very different. And so the types of plants that you find growing on an agricultural field, you know, obviously look way different than these native ecosystems. But if we take some of the soil from that, this agricultural field starts to look like that grassland, or that agricultural field starts to look like the heathland. So wherever that donor ecosystem, it starts to look like that. And that's true for the plants that we just looked at, the microbes that are living in the soil, and then these little roundworms, these nematodes that live in the soil. So we see that same pattern where they start to look more like their donor. Okay. So we covered that. And then I said that there's a lot of nuances. And there's a lot of, there's some limitations to this approach when we're talking about beneficial root-associated fungi that we call mycorrhiza. And then these two women did a meta-analysis. So they looked at all these papers that were testing this hypothesis, like, is this a good way to restore ecosystems? And so then they did a little meta-analysis to see if this actually is something that stays true across this broad range and through lots of different specific things. Like, right, one of the things I tried to hammer home to you guys is that restoring is case specific. And so they're saying, all right, can we pull out a broad trend out of all this big series of case specific stuff? And what they found is that, yes, actually we can. So essentially this dotted line here at the 0 mark is no effect. And if it's positive, if the error bars on these things don't overlap that 0 bar, then there was a positive effect. Then yes, this was an effective way in order to do restoration. And if the error bars cross the 0 line, then it was actually harmful. All right. And so overall, if we look at all studies, then yeah, actually using mycorrhizal fungi as inoculum to restore an ecosystem is actually helpful. And then they broke it down and talk about, okay, how does that compare to if we get inoculum from a reference ecosystem like the study that I just showed you, then there's, a positive effect. If we're using just one species of mycorrhizal fungi, then yeah, that's a positive effect. If we buy commercial inoculum, you can go onto Amazon and you can buy mycorrhizal fungi and they'll send it to you in a little tub. Was that effective? No. And then, okay, so then they're saying, how do you do this if you inoculate in the nursery or in the field? Still works. If you use arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, so the inside ones, it works. If you use the ectos, the outside ones, then it works. But that commercial inoculum, so why? Let's see, what is this difference? Oh, this is the plant response. What was this? Oh, the mycorrhizal colonization. Okay, so plants respond positively. Except for this commercial guy. Why would the commercial inoculum not be effective? Maybe talk about it with your partner for a second. if you wanted to sell and make money off of mycorrhizal inoculum, what things would you be looking for in the species of fungi that you selected? So talk about that for a second. See if you can come up with some ideas. All right, so what do you guys think? Yeah. Right, so you'd want them to be generalists, that you'd want them to be able to get with a lot of other plants. Like we talked about the New Zealand guys, like the New Zealand fungi were like, what the hell is this plant? Pines, I don't know what that is, I'm not gonna hang out with it. So you want species of fungi that are gonna associate with lots of things. Awesome. What else? Yeah.
Kind of also generalistic towards its environment, temperature, moisture.
Yeah, you want it to be able to live in a lot of places. What about trying to grow it in like a factory type setting? You want to mass produce this. What characteristics are you going to look for then? You want a whole lot of it, yeah. You want it to grow fast. You want it to make a lot of babies. Hey, I'm starting to hear a pattern. So fast growth rate, high reproduction, environmental, like wide environmental tolerance, wide host, like not just dependent on one species. What does that sound like? We've seen those traits before. Go ahead. It sounds like an invasive species. Exactly. So let me get to here. Okay, so what then are the costs? And that's the first one, is that we know we've talked about how mycorrhizal fungi can be invasive species in this class. How, yeah.
What damage can mycorrhizal fungi?
Well, if you ask the New Zealanders, so they can enable another invasive species. They can change how nutrients are cycled through an ecosystem. A lot of these ectomycorrhizal fungi have kept the ability to decompose. So like the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the inside ones, completely dependent on their host. They cannot live. They can't make sugar. They can't eat. Like they can't decompose dead things. They can't make lipids for their cell membranes. Totally, completely dependent on. But these other guys, these ectos, they're like, yeah, like when it's convenient, then we'll hang out with this plant, but only if it's gonna, like, what's the cost benefit ratio? And so they might not be necessarily very good mutualists. In fact, there's studies that have shown that mycorrhizal fungi can actually be harmful to plants in some situations. Okay, so, that's a big thing. We don't want to be introducing more invasive species. It can be expensive, right? Because okay, so we don't want to use the commercial inoculum. How do we do it? Right? There's logistics, you kind of have to know how to grow these fungi. You have to have the specialized equipment. You have to be able to do it. And do you even need it? Is it necessary for restoration? Okay. So this woman, Miranda Hart, she published a study that she looked at you know, what's the cost benefit ratio of using inoculum of these, or arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the AMF, you know, and one of her big concerns was the possibility of introducing more invasive species, because how do you manage something that you can't see? Right? Like we've talked about how difficult it is to manage these big, like the city of Flagstaffs, like Siberian elms, it's an invasive species. They're always chainsawing them down. And then the Siberian elms are like, that's adorable, we're just gonna resprout. But what do you do when you can't see the thing that you're trying to manage? Like it makes it harder. So that's the point. And then she had in this paper, she had this little decision tree about like when it is appropriate and not appropriate to be using mycorrhizal fungal inoculum in restoration. Let's see, do I have anything? Okay, so you know, and I've done several workshops where I talk to land managers about this and how to do it and how to grow them and what's the costs and the benefits and the limitations and stuff. So that's what these slides are from, some of that. Okay. So again, we had our 6 concepts. I don't know what this means, so we're just gonna like skip it. Okay, so I wanted to hit on these 4 and 5. That successful restoration draws on all relevant knowledge. And again, one of these social issues that we talked about is that you gotta include all the stakeholders. And so I'm gonna use an example again from the USGS. And they have up here, let's see, where are we? Up there at the Southwest Biological Science Center, they have this other program that's called the Restoration Assessment and Monitoring Program for the Southwest, or we just call it RAMPS because that's too many words to say. And also the federal government loves acronyms. And so this RAMPS program basically does both of these last 2 things, where they, you know, use evidence-based protocols and they engage with their stakeholders, and they have all these meetings where they talk about what are your priorities, how much money do you want to spend, you know, all the stuff to be able to implement these management practices. So I want to show you this picture, point this out real quick. So this little screen thing, they call a con mod, and I can't remember what that's an acronym for because there's too many acronyms. But it's a way to like, so the hypothesis was that you plant some little seeds here, and this windscreen will kind of be a buffering. It'll buffer the wind so it doesn't blow the seeds away, or it'll create a little bit of shade so it's not too hot for the little baby seeds. So there's that. And then this other component that they do, this Restore Net, is a series of common gardens across the Southwest, across the Colorado Plateau. And one of the things that they tried implementing at these gardens was, you can see that there's these little pits here that they're digging. They kind of scoop out the soil, they plant their seeds in there. And of all these different methods, those con mods and kind of this tarp thing and all these other ways that they tried to increase the success of their plants that they're putting in, it was actually these little divots, these little pits, that was actually the most successful. And they got this idea from their Native American stakeholders that they talked to at some of these meetings, because the indigenous folks are like, yeah, we've been doing this for thousands of years. This is the only thing that works. and it wasn't, and so they're like, well, let's systematically test it. because that's what we got to do that. And it was the only thing that worked. It was the cheapest because it doesn't cost any extra material. They'll dig a little hole, but that protects the seeds from getting blown away. It creates this little extra reservoir of water, creates a little bit of shade, especially in the evening and the mornings. So it was actually the most effective and the cheapest way to do restoration in the Southwest. And it's like, well, yeah, like these other people have been doing that for thousands of years, and we need to be listening to them. Okay, there's that rant. Okay, so now we can talk about other invasive microbes. And of course, we're going to talk about fungi, mostly because of I have a fungal bias. So we'll talk first about Dutch elm disease, and then we'll see how much time we have. If we have enough time to get to chestnut blight, then we will. This this white pine blister rust is another non-native fungal tree pathogen that's causing problems in the Southwest. And if you want to listen to me and my friend Erin talk about it, then you can listen to my podcast. Okay, blah, blah, blah. All right, so how are invasive microbes different than like plants or animals? Again, a lot of times we don't know that they're there unless they're causing problems. We've spent a lot of time and money, like hundreds of years, understanding where to find certain species of plants and certain species of fungi. There's a whole field called biogeography about knowing where living things are, but we really haven't done that with microbes. And so we don't know what the natural distribution of microbes are. So we don't really know if they're outside of their native range, because we don't know what their native range is. And then, it takes a lot of work to understand their biology. Like, what is the thing that's causing that plant disease? Where is it from? What kind of wacky life cycle does it have? Because often plant pathogens and other parasites often have these weirdo life cycles. They might spread faster. It's harder to prevent the transport of them. And if you're having multiple life cycles in a single growing season, you're gonna evolve faster. And so you might get resistance to those, to whatever the management options is. Remember, we talked about that with the rabbits in Australia and how they evolved resistance to the viruses that we were intentionally infecting with them. So, and rabbits is another good example of these short, fast life cycles where there's lots of babies. But microbes are even more so. Okay. So let's take a little case study and we'll walk down this nice little shady street. Look how beautiful that is, everybody. That's great. So these are American elms. On our first day of class, we walked out and we saw the one on North Quad that allegedly is from a cutting of a tree that George Washington planted in Washington, DC. And like the story is that like somebody like jumped over the fence and ran up and got a cutting and then smuggled it back to Arizona. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a good story. So, but anyway, these trees were used a lot on suburban streets like this because they're really great shade trees. And there's not very many American elms left because of this disease. It's caused by a fungus, Osteostoma ulmi. It was accidentally introduced to the US in the 30s. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that right now. And you can see how this whole part of the tree canopy is just gonzos. And so this is the same street before and after Dutch elm disease. And so like, you know, the heating and cooling costs of these houses would have gone way, way up. You know, this is a much more like aesthetically pleasing place to be. You know, and just within a few years, this disease completely wiped out this huge, you know, nice little alleyway of these trees that took decades to get to. All right. So this Dutch elm disease can affect every elm species. And depending on where the elms are from, it's more or less susceptible to this Dutch elm disease. So the genus Ulmus has, you know, over 30 species. Europe has a handful. We've got some, but Asia really is the area where there's the most diversity. And there's still new species being found because that's where this genus originated, right? So you have more genetic variability in the place where the species originated. And in this case, it's Asia. But you can see how it's kind of spread throughout the world, kind of, you know, in this nice little, what is that, probably, it's probably 30 to 30 or something, or 40, I don't know, whatever. The lat longs, I don't care. Okay. So these trees were like used all over the place. Not so much here in the West because it's too dry for them. The only reason that we have the American elm on North Quad is because we look after it a lot. It takes a lot of water, these guys. But these were awesome trees to plant along the sides of the streets. They grow fast. They can transport easily. So you can plant them everywhere that you don't mind sitting in the back of a truck for a while. A big thing is that they can tolerate soil compaction because like that's what you do when you make a road, right? Like you compact the soil and they're like, this is fine, we don't even care. And then they have these really tall, dense canopies, and their lowest branches are pretty high up. And so you're not gonna be smacking your truck against it and stuff like that. So it creates this nice little cathedral feel down the street. And east of the Rockies, it was like the most planted tree in the US. And in Europe and Asia too, because of all these traits that make it such great suburban, nice little icon of suburbia. Okay, so why do we call Dutch elm disease Dutch? And the short answer is because it was first discovered in the Netherlands in the 20s. And it was when their elms started to get sick that people were like, what's going on? You know, and so then this guy, Dr. Schwartz, was able to isolate it and to go through Koch's postulates to show that this is actually the thing that's causing this disease that we're seeing in these elms. So it's a wilt disease, it attacks the elms. This is in the genus or the phylum Ascomycota, but that's fine, we don't need to know. Here's a nice little scanning electron micrograph of a xylem cell. So remember, xylem are the pipes in the trees that take water, and in all plants, that take water from the roots up through the body and out the leaves. And so this area is all the plant cells, and then we have the fungi, the fungal hyphae growing inside of that cell. Okay. So again, let's see, I already talked about xylem. And so the problem is with this fungus is that the trees know that they don't want this. This is a bad guy. This is an enemy. And so what the plants will do is they'll create a protein that blocks off those xylem cells. And if you're blocking off the cells that carry your water, you're also blocking off your water supply. So why? So what? So like you cap the pipe, but like why do plants need water? Yeah. That's how you do photosynthesis. Exactly. You take that hydrogen, that water molecule, and you pop off one of the hydrogens, and now you got an OH group that you can do photosynthesis with. Woohoo! So they die of carbon starvation and drought. Okay, so I already said all these words. Look at that. So this protein that I'm not going to try to say blocks off that, and it causes this wilting that we see in the elms. And it also makes this nice little pretty bluish stain. Okay. So where does this thing come from? And the answer is we don't know, but we suspect that it comes from Asia because that's where its hosts originated. And when we talk about southwestern white, or sorry, not southwestern white pine. What's the thing? Blister rust. We go back to where, like we know it came from Asia, and that's where pines originated. And so we can kind of deduce that because there's elm species that are less susceptible to this disease, that they probably co-evolved together. And we know that that's why we have Siberian elms out here, is because the Siberian elms aren't really affected by this fungus. They're able to resist it. So we can say there's probably from that region where all these species are that don't get this. Okay. So it was brought to the US on European elm that hadn't been debarked. So whoever was bringing this shipment over left the bark on the wood. And why do you think that would matter? Who cares if you take the bark off or leave it on? I'll tell you who cares. The fungus cares. But also, these little beetles that carry the fungus around. And so look at this life cycle of this fungus. You have, you have the fungus, right? But you also have a beetle, and you also have the tree. So we have this complex life cycle. And we learned that when you have a complex life cycle, you're less likely to be invasive, right? So unless your symbionts are transported with you, which is what happened in this case. So these beetles are hanging out under the bark. In fact, they've got these little pockets where they keep their fungal spores, because the beetles need the fungus because they eat it. And so the beetles will dig down into the crotch of the tree. And as they're burrowing in, they're shedding spores. So they're leaving little fungal footprints. And then the fungi get into those xylem cells. Remember those pipes? It asexually reproduces, and then the trees are like, oh my God, this is bad. And so then they freak out and they plug up their own xylem cells and they cause the wilting. And one of the crazy things that made this fungus spread so quickly is another characteristic of elms is that they can fuse their roots with other individuals. So in those big lined streets, all of these trees are connected through their root system. That allows them to share water and nutrients, but it also allows them to share disease. Did you have something? Okay. Okay. So, and then, you know, if we cut these down, the beetles will lay their eggs under the bark. They have these cool little galleries that we'll look at. The fungi grow inside of these little galleries. And when the babies emerge, they pick up those fungal spores, and then they go and they fly to another tree several miles away and spread that invasive fungus. You don't need to know the details of this life cycle. So you can kind of get an understanding that we have beetles and that we have trees and it's complex, but you don't need to know every step. Okay, so, you know, we had that bark beetle. I just said that the bark beetle was introduced at the same time the fungus was, but we also have bark beetles that are native to the Americas that do similar things. And they're actually able to carry that fungus pretty effectively. So the fungus is like, I can hitch a ride on the European version or the American version. It doesn't matter. I'm still going to get to my next tree, the next host. And so here's the beetle. There's some of the eggs. And then can't really see it on the screen, but there's this fuzz here. And that's the actual fungus. Okay. So how does the disease get around? So we have the native elm beetle that transports it. We also have the European elm beetle that transports it. And again, the beetles can fly, dispersing the disease fungus. So here's a little drawing of the European version and the American version. And I'm using American as in North America and not the United States. So really, in the US and Canada, it is the American version of that beetle that's causing it. And other places, like here, it's the European beetle that we have to keep an eye on our American elm out here in the quad that way. Okay, so a way to manage this beetle is that you just freeze it. They can't handle the larvae, can't handle really cold temperatures. So anything below 6 degrees Fahrenheit, they're gonna die. So knowing this complex life cycle allows us clues in how to manage this disease. Okay. And so this looks like crap up here. Looks better on my screen. So there's these little spores and they stick to the bark beetles and they carry them around. Here's what their beetle galleries look like. So they're actually really cool. So the mama will come in from the bark and she'll dig this tunnel and then she'll be depositing eggs as she goes along. And then the larvae go off and dig these other side branches. And yeah, and then as they emerge, when the babies emerge as adults, they travel back along here and they're picking up the fungi as they're crawling through. Okay, so I talked about this when so naturally elms will graft their roots with each other, and so within 50 feet they can actually have these big connections. And the person that I learned this from when I was an undergrad is from Ontario. And he was talking about how when he was a little boy, the elms were that nice big cathedral thing that overarched the street. And then when he was a teenager, you would start to see like one tree and then another tree. And then all the trees on the one side of the street would go. And it was because of these root grafts where they were just there. When the trees are too late and they don't put that protein in to stop up the xylem, then that fungus can spread really quickly. And then again, infected logs, which is how it was introduced to the US in the first place. And similar to our mountain pine beetles and our other bark beetles that are problematic for our pines in the West, you don't want to transport your firewood because you don't know if that wood is infected. And so you're not supposed to go to like a campsite, cut down some wood. You didn't burn it all. So now you take it back with you. It sits in your garage for a few months, and then you take that wood to the next place you're going camping. Well, that has a possibility of spreading these fungi that are plant pathogens. So saprotrophic, who knows what that word means? It eats dead things. So so the fungus is saprotrophic, it can eat that wood, it can live off the wood. It doesn't have to be, that's how, it doesn't have to be, the wood doesn't have to be living. Okay, so what do you do? If you have Dutch elm disease, what do you do? Well, first thing that you got to do is watch it. And if you notice that there's one branch that's getting wilty, you go and you cut that off right away. Why would you do that? A quick response of getting that branch before as soon as it starts to wilt. Yeah.
I would confirm that the plant is native.
Yeah, so you want to isolate it, right? Like you don't want that disease to spread. So you want to cut it off before. That's why being modular is really helpful. We can't do that. It's like, oh man, I got an infection in my fingernail. I'll just cut that off. No. But if you're a plant, you can do that. So removing those infected branches or trees. The other thing that's commonly done is that you'll see these trenches dug in the grass here. Why do that? Yeah, you're removing the root grafts. You're quarantining. We did that. So yeah, so you don't want it spreading to the neighboring trees. And so you just like smash their roots and then they don't have that connection anymore. You can also do what NAU does and sprays herbicide and fungicide on that tree to kill the beetles and the fungus. And then something that's happening now that takes a lot of time and money and effort, and is another reason why we have Siberian elms, is because you might want to breed resistance by hybridizing. I think we've talked before in this class about how hybrids can allow an insect to go from one host species to another host species through a small series of steps instead of one giant leap. Well, we can kind of do that same thing, but backward, is that we can create varieties of elm trees through hybridization that have some of that genetic resistance to the fungus in this case. And that's why Siberian elms, there's Chinese elms, there's kind of some of these other species of elms that are from Asia that have naturally evolved with this fungus that has that natural genetic resistance. And so now we're trying to yoink some of those genes and put them in our American elms. Okay. We'll see. You know what? Let's call it there. This is basically the same stuff. Again, another fungus that's caused the decline of a hugely important tree. And there's this, I'll just say that there's this YouTube video, oops, that you can watch that talks about chestnuts, American chestnuts, because these trees were like so economically and ecologically important, but then they're being lost to an invasive fungal disease. Okay, so the only thing that I'll say here, this same thing, the chestnuts, they're trying to breed them. They're doing the same thing, that they're genetically modifying them, transgenic, right? So you take a gene from something that's similar, that's closely related, and you plop it in another species. So there's our little goldfish that are all these neon colors. They're not supposed to be like that. Or you can, cisgenic is just taking genes from certain individuals and putting them in a different individual of the same species. So, you know, those are other ways that these invasive species are, we're developing management practices for. And so this cisgenic is how chestnuts and elms are being bred, rather than this taking it from others. Okay. All right. So we have our last quiz on Tuesday. We will go over we'll do like a little case study. There's a short little reading that's like 2 pages. It's a narrative. It's like a 4th grade reading level. So just take a look at that. And then we'll have like a little video on Tuesday after the quiz, and we'll have some little discussion questions about that. You guys are working on your little fact sheet things. Okay. If you have them done, go ahead and turn them in early. So they're just due on the last day of class, which is a week from today. So, but you can turn it in to me anytime you want to. Okay. Questions? All right. I'll see you guys next week. Have a good weekend.